Hi, and welcome to another video on metal roofing systems. Today we're joined by Technical Services Manager Jeff Haddock. So, Jeff, what sealants do you recommend for metal roofing systems?
There are three primary sealant categories that we utilize in metal roofing systems. The most popular being non-skinning, non-curing butyl. Then we have what we call as an extruded form of butyl, non-curing butyl, which is we call our butyl tapes. And then we have what are a family known as our curing sealants, and those are generally made of a single component urethane. Within that family, there are also some silicones that are available in the market that are color matched to meet and match the color of the roof system that they're installed on.
So, what are the primary differences? You mentioned a couple of sciencey butyl and urethane, and I don't know any about that. What are the kind of primary differences between those types of sealants?
The vast majority of standing seam metal roof details are concealed attached metal roof details, and most exposed fastener as well. They're designed to be installed with concealed applied sealants, right? We don't want this roof that we've just spent all this money on to have a bunch of sealant all over the place. It's the same concept of not having a lot of exposed fasteners on a standing seam panel. It's not designed that way. The way that our sealants are designed, and these are all specifically called out for use in our installation details, is with butyl, a lot of the butyl is used for material and flashing laps, right? And the reason that we like butyl is that it will never cure or harden, and it allows for metal roof expansion and contraction to take place without actually compromising that sealant line. The only problem with butyl is the butyl is not able to be exposed to UV or sunlight, and that can break down the sealant, which is why we primarily use butyl in concealed flashing laps and other areas where dynamic thermal movement may be taking place, where we don't want to compromise the sealant line, but it's all going to be provided in a concealed or installed in a concealed fashion because we don't want it exposed to the sun or UV exposure because that'll eventually break down that sealant. By comparison, if you were to use a curing sealant or hardening sealant in areas that are subjected to the thermal movement, what can happen is that sealant line can actually shear off. And then the benefits of utilizing that sealant where that sealant is or crack or break away, you could have water infiltration if the improper sealant was used. One cool thing about butyl is I've actually taken roofs apart that have been installed for 15, 20 years before during some investigations, and butyl, we have a term that we like to call, it's called roofing snot, and it's just as nasty and sticky as the day it was applied. When I'm taking a lot of these projects apart for certain investigations on leak mitigation and things. And that's one of the big reasons why we like using butyl, is it'll stay intact, provided it's not used in an exposed manner. The other categories of sealants we have in there, one of them being butyl tape. Butyl tape operates under the same principle as a gun grade non-curing butyl sealant, but butyl tape is used for high infiltration areas. It's an extruded mass of butyl, holds its shape, is generally available in a tape product, can range in width and thicknesses. But what we usually use that for is high infiltration areas such as eave lines, up at ridge conditions, under Z closures, in valleys. This sealant is designed to be used under compression. So usually what we'll do is under a joggle cleat at an eave line or in a valley, we'll put butyl tape underneath that, and then we screw through it to compress that sealant. And that's going to prevent any of that moisture from blowing back up and up underneath the flashing or up underneath the roof system, because it's a permanent stopgap that's under compression, not exposed to the elements, and it prevents any of that seepage from taking place. Now, the third category we have in there is what we call our curing sealants, or urethanes, or siliconized sealants. What this is generally intended for is non-moving joinery or gap fillers where it may necessitate an exposed sealant that is subjected to exposure to the elements and may require some exposure to UV and has some of that UV resistance. And we use this to seal up gaps. I mean, we use single component urethanes for sealing up gaps around windows, where large gaps might be, or if we're sealing up exposed penetrations or something along that line. And then we have the siliconized style sealants, that are color matched. So if you do need to apply sealant in an exposed fashion, because generally urethanes are available in white and gray. Well, what if you have a green roof or a blue roof? You don't want to use a white or a gray sealant on it. You want something that's going to match that. So the siliconized sealants are designed to be color matched. Now, one word I would caution you on is that a lot of what we deal with in our industry is the Kynar paint systems. Kynar paint systems are notorious for not liking certain sealants to stick to them. Manufacturers have approved sealant lists around what can be applied to Kynar and what shouldn't be applied to Kynar. General bathroom silicone or caulking is not the same as a metal roof silicone because it's specifically formulated to adhere to Kynar. Kynar paint finishes are in the same formulation or family as a Teflon coating. So if you know about Teflon coatings in your pan, you know that's very difficult to get things to stick to it. Well, that's the same thing with our Kynar paint system. Single component urethanes. That's the scientific term for that family of urethane sealants. We know that the single component urethanes don't have an issue adhering to Kynar painted products. Butyl will stick to anything. It's like I said, we call it roofing snot. But when you're getting into the silicones for color match, you need to be sure you're looking at it closely on the limitation uses section on that to be sure it's going to adhere to whatever paint system you're using. And that necessarily means it needs to be a Kynar system. You have, polyester paint systems, silicone modified polyester paint systems. There's a whole array of different paint systems used on metal applications. But again, you want to make sure that it's going to adhere properly and it's fit for purpose, can stand up to the elements if need be, allows for thermal movement. And again, most manufacturers do have proper written instructions around what sealants are supposed to be used, where they're supposed to be used, and how they're supposed to be used. And if you're not sure, you have a particular sealant that you want to use that may not be on an approved list by a particular manufacturer, you are more than welcome to reach out to us because we will advise you whether or not it is suitable for that application.
Sealants that contractors apply in the field, but there's also, I guess, certain sealants that we factory apply in our panels themselves. What type of sealant is that, and typically what panels come with the factory applied sealant?
When we're dealing with factory applied sealant, and this comes back into thinking about that whole expansion and contraction, one can guess probably what type of sealant we're putting into the factory leg, and that would be our non-skinning butyl. And the reason for that is because the panels are thermally responsive to heat and cool. If we put in a sealant within that factory leg that was curing or drying or hardening, any shift or movement within that panel would compromise that sealant line. Whereas if utilizing the non-curing, non-skinning butyl sealant within those factory legs, that allows that panel to shift back and forth without actually tearing apart or compromising that sealant line, making sure you have a weather-tight seal within the seam of the actual profile for the life of the roof system.
So it's primarily applied in the factory in the standing seam itself in one of the leg.
That's correct. We have select areas. It varies by profile, but we have certain select areas where when the panel engages each other, that sealant is also engaged between the two panel ribs to prevent moisture from getting in and blowing into the seams through wind-driven events, through snow packs, and all the various reasons why a panel seam would leak.
And is that usually done standard, or do customers or contractors need to specify when they want panels with factory applied sealant?
For us as a company, factory sealant is standard in our standing seam profiles.
Got it.
With a few caveats, of course. Now, let's say we're dealing with a curved panel application. Well, when we curve a panel or we radius a panel, so we'll roll form it off of the mill flat, and then that necessitates us to put it through another machine to get the curvature that we need. And unfortunately, because of that machine that we use to radius the panels in has to do a secondary process on the panel, we can't apply factory sealant to curved panels because otherwise it would gum up the rollers, the sealant would be all over the panels, and it would just be a horrible application. Curved panels do necessitate field application of sealants. Another panel family that does require field application of sealants is our corrugated style panels or exposed fastener panels. And that's because of the way that we package these style panels. They are what we know as nestable panels, meaning when we package them, they're stacked one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. Well, if we had factory sealant applied in there, that sealant goo would be smashed out and spewing out everywhere. So exposed style fastener panels, that necessitates field application of sealant in the field for those types of panels. Now, if you're dealing with a generalized standard install, standing seam roof, straight runs, 100% of those types of panel applications are going to have factory sealant applied from us in the factory.
So it sounds like the biggest thing to get right or that can go wrong is selecting the wrong type of sealant. You're up on roofs and you do a lot of inspections. Are there any other kind of common issues you see with sealant application or the usage of sealants in general?
Yeah, the improper placement, the improper type of sealant used. I've seen everything from I've seen butyl sealant used in exposed application, and a real quick test to do on that is just go up and touch it, and if it's stringing and pulling apart, we know that butyl was used in exposed application, and it's not going to last very long at all. Eventually, what will happen is the sealant will begin to break down, deteriorate. It turns a very dark color and will flake off. And at that point, it's no good. Biggest thing is obviously if the sealant's in the wrong place, right? We want to make sure that we're adhering to installation details for the specific placement and type of that sealant. So biggest thing is making sure that you're using an appropriate sealant for the application. Is it going to be joinery that's going to be subject to thermal movement? Is it going to be concealed? Is it going to be exposed? Is it going to be non-moving joinery? These are all different factors to take into consideration, and a lot of our install guides will dictate what type of sealant or family of sealants should be used. One thing in our detail guides is you will not see a lot of exposed sealant application callouts in our details because a lot of our details are designed and intended to have concealed sealants. Right. The exposed sealants are generally there you can't account for all instances that happen out there. Sometimes there's gaps that need to be sealed up, and you don't want to necessarily take all the flashings and roofing apart. So that would allow you to use it sparingly in an exposed application, but then noting that you need to make sure you're using the proper sealant that's going to stand up to the elements if you're going to be putting it in an exposed application.
So I guess a big red flag is if you're looking at a metal roof and there's sealant that you can see everywhere, then that's a really bad install.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big red flag if you're seeing sealant everywhere.